year 3, year 4, or just, sometime in that kind of first 5 to 7 years, maybe,
Yeah.
that's when you find out who you're actually pastoring.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, that's right.
uh, the
Yeah.
honeymoon's over. That well, and there's a trade-off. They know who you are as well. They know, who you are apart from the search process and the image that you put up.
Welcome to the Pastor's Lab podcast, a new resource for helping church leaders think biblically and strategically about the local church. In each episode, I'll talk with thriving leaders on the front lines of ministry nationwide. I'm Ronnie Parrott, and I believe churches get better when their leaders learn together. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining. Joining me as my co-host this week is Pastor Matt Capps. Matt is the lead pastor at Fairview Baptist Church in Apex, North Carolina, and has authored and contributed to many books, including the Bible. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Hey, let's clarify that. I have not authored the Bible. I was the editor of a devotional Bible. That's a big difference. I have not pulled a joke.
Okay.
I'm not just
All
a
right.
speaker.
Well, each week I'm joined by a co-host and a guest that will be interviewing, and today's guest is Jared Wilson. Jared is assistant professor of pastoral ministry and author in residence at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and staff pastor for preaching and director of pastoral training at the training center at Liberty Baptist Church in Kansas City, Missouri. An award-winning author of over 20 books, Jared also hosts his own podcast for the Church Podcast and co-hosts the Heart of Pastoring podcast. Jared, thanks for joining us today.
Ronnie, thanks for having me, brother. Matt, it's good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
I want to encourage all of our listeners today, if you benefit from the conversation, please share and subscribe to the podcast. We're hopeful of a really good conversation. Jared, you are well known from many of the books you've written and from pastoring and being where you are at Midwestern. Why don't you just give our listeners a quick like 1 to 2 minute snapshot of your story?
Of my story. Yeah, it's a long story. I grew up in the church, SBC life. And in 1994, it's actually 30 years ago this summer, the summer I graduated high school, assumed my first ministry position as a youth minister for a Chinese Baptist church in Houston, Texas, and was sort of neck deep, if not deeper, in that time in kind of the seeker-sensitive church world in the kind of attractional paradigm, and did about 10 years, maybe actually probably a little bit more than that, of ministry in different capacities in that world. Landed in Nashville, Tennessee. My wife worked for Lifeway at the time, the Baptist Sunday School Board, and for a number of years, about 15 years or so. And we found ourselves in Nashville, where she was working for Lifeway Corporate. And we were last at kind of seeker church there, and went through a personal train wreck in my own life, kind of the rotten fruit of my own sin, and entered a period of depression and really despair. And I'm cliffs noting that it's a very long, drawn-out story, but in the midst of that, experienced kind of a gospel renaissance in my life. Became aware, just personally, this was, before I was ever aware of any kind of, gospel movement or anything like that. Just in the guest bedroom of our home in Nashville, Tennessee, like the prodigal son kind of, came to his senses, came to himself. I had a kind of pigsty moment where I realized the gospel was for me. It wasn't, just for me when I was lost. It was actually for me as a Christian. And it really turned my life upside down, and it changed everything. My trajectory continued in ministry after that time, but had really kind of a new lease on life because of this awakening. And post the kind of restoration of my marriage, and the doors being opened again to ministry, still in that seeker church, began to kind of pull on the thread of what it means to do ministry from a quote unquote gospel-centered perspective. and ended up planting a church in Nashville a couple years later, and then pastored a church in rural Vermont for a number of years before finally moving here to Kansas City in 2015. And so the last 15 years or so, give or take, have been my working out kind of what happened to me in that guest bedroom, which apart from my conversion, I still think is kind of the most defining moment of my life, not just ministry, but my life. So certainly my ministry.
I'm thankful that Willow Creek Wilson is no longer in existence, but part of me wants to go back to that stage of your life and just to see you play some type of silly game or lead in that type of environment. I think that would be fairly interesting.
Well, you know what's funny? So like I was I also did student ministry at a it was very consciously, intentionally a Willow Creek model church plant in Houston. In fact, we were in the Willowbrook area of Houston. There's a Willowbrook Mall. We were in that area. So our church was Willowbrook Community Church. And not only did I serve on the student ministry, but I was head of the drama teams. Acted and directed and even wrote some sketches for us to do on Sunday mornings, because that was kind of the fashion at the time.
Oh man,
that's fascinating.
I want to talk with Becky about this at some point, but
if I ever had a cage stage, brothers, like I was into Reformed theology. I think, I know before kind of even this gospel awakening thing in my life, I'd kind of become a Calvinist, but my exposure to that was so mild, and it was really in the context of a couple of friends of mine at the Baptist bookstore who were on opposite ends of this, spectrum, who were best friends. So, when I sort of, became a Calvinist, it was so like, yeah, okay. I don't think I ever had a cage stage Calvinism phase, but I certainly was a cage stage seeker church guy. I made fun of all of the non-seeker people, like, you don't care about lost people. I was off the charts a jerk about what I look back now and go, what, I needed somebody in my life to kind of put their arm around me and just say, you need to settle down. So I kind of got it out of the way with the seeker stuff. I was sold out. I really was. It wasn't anything I was dabbling in. I was writing papers. I was trying to write articles and submit them to Christianity Today, arguing for, seeker sensitivity and all these sorts of things. I was a real idiot, let me tell you.
Oh, this is cool.
Looking back over the last 10 or 15 years, it does kind of seem like that seeker-sensitive movement has sort of dissipated or decreased, while this, as you use the word, gospel renaissance has sort of increased. Is that what you're seeing in the churches you're following?
Well, 20, 30 years ago, really 30 years ago, just about, there were really just kind of two primary models that people, when someone was trying to do the seeker thing, you had Willow Creek and you had Saddleback, and those were kind of the two, pioneers of the movement. In fact, the very first book that my first kind of mentor in ministry took me through was The Purpose-Driven Church by Rick Warren. And then in '96, we went to the Willow Creek Church Leadership Conference, there outside Chicago. And back then, the leadership conference was very much like for church leaders, how to do church like we do church. Now it's kind of morphed into more of a business kind of leadership sort of emphasis, Christian influence, but you have the Tyson Chicken CEO and things like that. Now I don't think it's really receded. It's really just sort of turned into like 31 flavors. So there's that's why I don't usually use the phrase seeker sensitive or seeker church anymore. It's more just kind of the attractional paradigm, which has a lot of different kind of genres to it, maybe, and styles to it. And I think there's even churches that use the traditional sort of thing, the kind of thing that I would have made fun of as a seeker church guy, having a choir and just the trappings of the traditional. But it's really an attractional paradigm because they're just trying to get the consumers who like that kind of thing. So in some ways, it's a little more challenging today because it's so diffused into evangelical culture. And yes, we did have, I think, kind of a gospel recovery movement, but even that has, in a lot of ways, balkanized and kind of fractured out into all these sort of different ministry silos and organizations, and the influence of the gospel-centered thing as an institution I think those days are, over, or at least significantly diminished from where they were,
Mm-hmm.
Sort of the mid 2000s.
Mm. So if you were talking to a let's say a young pastor steps into a new church and the church is sort of going every which way, but what's missing is in a lot of ways the gospel. I mean, the gospel is being presented in the sermon. Toward the end, they're sharing the gospel, giving invitations and such. How would you encourage that pastor to really think through the ministry as a whole to bring it back to gospel centrality?
Yeah, well, one of the impulses that I think guys who are kind of form-minded that way, I want to make my church more gospel-centered. One of the instincts or impulses that they tend to have is at cross purposes with actual gospel centrality, because we become policemen for for gospel centered stuff, and become in some ways legalistic, maybe not in the proper theological sense of that word, but we become legalistic about gospel centrality. I usually try to remind younger pastors who are really kind of sold out on the model to number one, understand the substance of gospel centrality, what it means for preaching, what it means for pastoral care, what it means for understanding how people change and that sort of thing. But also just to think about how they came to it themselves. And it usually was not because somebody pressured them or, leaned on them or nagged them about being gospel centered. It was a somewhat natural or organic awakening of some kind. Maybe, certainly there were, influence, maybe mentored or discipled. And so just as we would say to any young, pastor coming to a church thinking about changing things, the things that adorn gospel centrality are, gracious disposition to be patient with people, to pick your battles, to not push too hard, to not lead in a domineering way. The primary point of kind of steering that ship, and if it's been entrenched in maybe sort of a default pragmatism or even kind of a legalistic culture for a long, long time, you're not going to see it change in a sermon series, or in a matter of 6 weeks or even a year. It's gonna be just a sort of patient plodding, showing people the glory of Jesus in every text as you preach week in, week out. And as you love people, if you function from a gospel-centered disposition, you're adorning the philosophy in ways that are much more powerful and influential than if you're just telling people to be gospel-centered all the time.
Yeah, I think when I think about your ministry, at least recently, so you just somewhat recently became the preaching pastor at Liberty Baptist, which is, you were already preaching there, but this is more of let's say more of your time has been given to preaching at this church. And so part of that, developing that gospel disposition, is going to be your pastoral rhythms. So, I think about, if I were to ask you, if I look at your life and think, hey, you're a professor over here, you're writing, you're preaching very regularly at this church, what are some of the spiritual rhythms that you practice regularly that you would say help shape that gospel disposition that you would encourage other brothers to really lean into?
Yeah, well, like, functionally, it's not much different than I think any believer really, even who's,
Yeah.
Obviously my time is, just because of my vocation, is spent more in the Bible and things than, the layperson who has, a quote unquote secular job might. But in terms of like, how do you grow? How do you see the fruit of the Spirit in your life? Bible study and prayer functionally is the two chief spiritual disciplines, or, others besides. But what I have discovered, and I've had to kind of rediscover, because I'm a hard-headed, person, and even the older I get, the more I see the fruit of sanctification in my life, but also the more sin I see that I need to work on and ask the Lord's help with. The rediscovery is not just that you're doing those things. Those things, are non-negotiable really for believers. But how I do those things, how I approach reading my Bible every day, how I approach the act of prayer every day. And for a long time, and particularly in my childhood and adolescence, I approached those things as a religious person. I mean, I was a believer. I don't think I was, unconverted, but it was a religious duty. And And I wanted to be a good person, and I wanted to be a religious person, and I wanted to learn a lot. So I would go to the Bible to just get more information and to be right about certain arguments or just about certain ideas. And that's all well and good. We don't want to be wrong about about things.
Mm.
But it took me a long time to kind of see coming to the Word of God as hearing God's voice, like He's speaking to me, yes, as my master, as my Lord, as my God, but also as my friend. And I would say even after gospel centrality or whatever came into my life, it still was a long, hard lesson for me of coming to the Bible that way. So like functionally, the first thing I do in the morning, and this is a late adoption, probably the last 3 or 4 years. If I had to track it, probably the last 3 years, I've gotten into the habit. It's not my in-depth Bible study, but when I pick up my phone, when my alarm goes off, because I use my phone for my alarm like a lot of people do, I used to, Jared past, would turn off the alarm and pull up email, primarily just to remind myself. I use my email inbox as kind of like my to-do list or my calendar. I'm looking at what I'm going to do with my day. What am I going to be thinking about? What am I getting ready? All these sorts of things. What's my first appointment? Or scrolling social media or something like that. And I've gotten into the habit of the very first thing I do when I turn off my alarm is open up my Bible app and just graze for a little bit. And this is like, literally, I'm laying down in bed. I'm not sitting up. I'm not going to the desk with an open Bible book. It's just me. And it's just a few minutes and I'm half awake. So again, it's not concentrated study. It's just, I want, and I'm trusting that over time, this is really shaping me. I want God's voice to be the first voice I hear in the morning. Now, sometimes, my wife gets in there first because she sees I'm awake and says something, but
Right.
I got to say, hey, you're not God.
That's right.
So,
Quieten down,
just
Becky.
kidding. I don't do that, but yeah, it's to the extent that I'm able, and it's been pretty consistent. Is I alternate Old and New Testament and just kind of, I haven't been in this book for a while. It's not a directed reading plan or anything. It's just I want to be taking in God's word the very first thing in the morning, and then it's later when I'm a little more awake. And just depending on what my day is like, where I spend more time in the Word for either sermon prep or just kind of digging around. And then prayer also, usually afternoons or evenings. I go outside for that. This is sort of a practice I developed when I lived in Vermont, and there was just a lot of beautiful stuff to look at. But I realize I'm a very indoorsy person. I like to be outside, but I'm not really an outdoorsy kind of guy. I'm not a hiker or fisher or anything like that. But I have to be outside. I have to see the sky. I have to see, clouds or the trees or something. And the time I spend in prayer when I'm outside is more of a kind of, talking to my friend, Jesus, and trying to remember that he's a real person and not just an idea. And that has been a hard lesson for me to learn as well.
so good.
The whole idea of being outside with the Lord is it's just special. It's just different being outside looking in this creation. That's one of my favorite rhythms, is to be outside early in the morning, 5 a.m., just me and the Lord.
That's too
It's
early,
just a
man.
different
That's too
ballgame
early.
in a sense.
I'm not even saved at that time, I don't think.
I'm still resting in the Lord at 5 a.m.
Yeah, we have 6 kids. The only time we have that's quiet is early. On the same subject of rhythms, you've traveled a lot. You do travel a lot. You've been asked to preach all over the world. How have you learned to balance family, ministry? I know you have a couple daughters. How have you found the time to make sure family's priority, marriage is priority?
Yeah, well, it's easier these days. I'm an empty nester now, so in some ways, this has been a really sweet season that even when I'm super busy, for most travel, my wife's able to come with me and to kind of feel like we're a team in those endeavors has been, it's been great for us. It's been great for me. But even before that, when we had kids at home, especially when they were littler, my wife is just the ingredient without which it wouldn't work. when I was sort of traveling either by myself or, maybe taking one of the ministry residents or something like that with me, um, she has an independence, a healthy independence where, she's not needy. There wasn't the phone calls when I'm away about how things are falling apart and, all those sorts of things. And so she just was very supportive and very encouraging during those seasons. And I would have, given that stuff up if I had, in some ways discerned, or if she had said to me, this is not working. When you're gone, things don't work here. And I'm not able to hold things down by myself and all those sorts of things. But when I was, when I was full-time pastoring and I had kids at home, and it was certainly out of my, concern for my family, but also for my church as well, I limited weekends away. So when I was pastoring in Vermont, for instance, I was preaching there probably 46 or more weeks a year. I was rarely gone on a Sunday. So any of the speaking engagements I took had to be things where I would be back before Sunday. It's not easy when you're gone and the kids are still in school, but when that's easier than being gone on the weekends when they're home all day and there's more family time that's possible. So we really prioritized that during that season, and during the regular rhythms of working at the church when I wasn't traveling, and I do a lot more these days than I did then anyway. So in some ways, that's been a sweetness of providence that now that we're empty nesters and I do have more freedom, I have a lot more opportunities also. So that's probably just the development of becoming, I guess, more well known and in the marketplace, I guess. But when I was sort of not traveling and just doing week out ministry, I took Fridays off, and those were for me and Becky. So especially during the school year, our kids were they went to school, so we had Fridays almost every week just for the two of us to get out and go do some stuff, and then Saturdays I took off also, and that was for my family. So incorporating that as sort of not just the regular rhythm, but I'm drawing kind of a fence around it, saying unless there's some emergency, and we all know, brothers, that ministry doesn't stay confined and in those areas and any more than it does in a kind of 9 to 5 sort of weekday area. But to the extent that I was able, unless there was an emergency or just a dire need, Fridays and Saturdays, that was for my family every single week, and I think that really kind of helped stave off some of that "you're married to the church" kind of feeling.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple things. I want to kind of draw into another question. So one, there's this call of pastors to have that time with God where you're not reading the Bible to prayer, you're not being distracted by so many other things like emails and calendars. You have the call to be a good husband, a good father. Those are challenges that I think all of us have to wrestle with and figure out how to steward well. What I want to ask you is, as you talk to the students you're training at the seminary and other pastors that you're in networks with, you think about a rapidly changing world and really the function of the church and what's happening both outside the church and inside the church. What would you say are some of the most the biggest challenges that pastors are facing today? What are the things that come up most commonly in your conversations when you're talking to guys who are reaching out for help?
What's really interesting is the major things that guys reach out about have stayed pretty much consistently the same over the last 10 to 15 years. If you're living kind of part of your life online and I don't, and I think that's fine, but you can get a distorted picture of what's really facing the church. And there's some things obviously that we discuss online or people debate or get upset about that are, I guess, challenges in certain contexts and things like that. But the majority of things that, when I pull up Twitter several times a day, the majority of things that people, even pastors, are arguing about on there are not things that have come up in my, in my church context over the last number of years. And maybe my church is really unique, but the things that guys call about is there's a family in my church that's super influential, and if there's a change I'm going to make that they're going to be upset about. I mean, it's the same stuff that's just congregational life. It's just always been the same. It's sin, it's divisiveness, it's gossip, it's distrust of leadership, it's pastors being stupid and doing, rash things or immature things. It's the same stuff that really it's always been. And sometimes we have these, influence of things from the wider culture or from, evangelical culture, that may make inroads with given populations in our church or different demographics in our church. And so I'm not trying to downplay, if someone's trying to figure out how do I sort out the Christian nationalism debate and all those sorts of things, because those are important issues. But that's not
really
what
the point
guys
of
are.
this
That's not what
conversation is to get there and to make you sort it out for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, we can't wait to hear your answer.
You're supposed to
a
tell us.
Baptist Christian
Yes.
nationalist is kind of a contradiction in terms. So I find it funny when some of the Baptists go after the concept, rightly understood. When people if all they mean is Christians should have influence in the political realm, and the nation should protect or even be influenced by Christian heritage. That's not really Christian nationalism. Yeah, but if you're a Baptist and a Christian nationalist, you really need to read some Baptist history and some Baptist thinking.
Well, I'll say this, because I'm friends with both you guys. I've talked to both of you guys about different challenges that we face here at the church, or I'm facing in pastoral ministry. And one of the things I appreciate about our conversations is always, from my perspective, it may look like a challenge, or it may I just don't know what to do, like in the moment. And to talk to other brothers about it, and to see those challenges become opportunities for either one, like growth and depth of understanding the gospel, or giving God the room to actually move and work in ways you wouldn't imagine. And so I imagine you have those conversations with your students all the time who hit a wall, or they face a challenge and they just don't know what to do. They've never faced it before. They're kind of it's out of their league, and just to have that older voice of pastoral wisdom say, "Look, this is actually an opportunity." I don't know if you've had those moments recently, or if that is just part of your regular conversation. If you were to talk to a guy and say, "Hey, if you're gonna mentor other pastors or talk to other pastors, here's how you take a conversation about a challenge and help them see it as an opportunity." What kind of advice would you give to somebody that's seeking to do that?
Yeah, well, there's no substitute for reminding someone, first of all, that year 3, year 4, or just sometime in that kind of first 5 to 7 years, maybe. That's when you find out who you're actually pastoring.
Yeah, that's right.
The honeymoon's over. And there's a trade-off. They know who you are as well. They know, who you are apart from the search process and the image that you put up. They've heard the same stupid story that you use every, third week in preaching, just whatever it is, your leadership deficiencies, you don't communicate enough, or whatever it is, the rose-colored glasses are off, and you suddenly discover who it is that you're actually pastoring. The thing I think to, remind guys of is to say every pastor, and I think you guys would probably agree with this. You've been in ministry for a while yourselves, but every guy that we know who's like 20, 30 years older than us, who's been at the same church for that length of time or thereabouts, had a very similar experience. It would be uncommon to pastor in one place for a long time, multiple decades, and not have gone through an early crisis of some kind, or an early challenge of some kind. And they're now in a place where, I described it as the pasture lands. In the first few years, you're in the thicket, and you're disoriented. Things feel like they're pressing on you, especially if you're trying to lead some kind of change or reform in some way. So you haven't really cleared the land out, maybe, and you haven't really got your bearings. But there is a pasture, and I think we just need to remind younger guys, and we need to remind older guys to remind younger guys that, like, hey, there's a pasture land here. And if you just keep trusting the Lord, keep loving people, keep preaching the word, you're going to get to it. And so many guys, in the thicket, decide to just jump into another thicket, which is really counterproductive. They go to another place where it seems like the grass is greener, and then it just is just as tall 3 or 4 years in. And Matt, you know this, that in the last few years we've conducted a search for a new lead pastor, and received a great number of resumes, and quite a few of them you're looking through, and I see a succession of 3 to 4 year pastorates. For some of those guys, that there may be entirely justifiable reasons. I'm not trying to say for every guy,
Yeah.
he never got a raw deal or anything like that. But when you see that over and over again, and you see 4 or 5 consecutive 3 to 4 year pastorates, I think we're just going to be the next 3 to 4 year pastorate for this guy. And we need to learn, apart from something that's really damaging to your family or just an insurmountable thing, to kind of press through and see ministry as a marathon and not a sprint.
Man, that's really good. I really appreciate this about both of you guys. You both have a heart for longevity in ministry and how important longevity in ministry is. What kind of advice would you give a guy who's starting off in his first year? I know you just kind of shared a couple of brief things, but what one piece of advice would you give a guy who's just stepping into the church? He's maybe just finished seminary. He's ready to go. Church has just called him. What kind of advice would you give him?
Yeah, well, it's not original, but and I think there, Richard Baxter says something to this effect. No, Richard Sibbs says something to this effect about people listening to those that they know love them. And what I usually say to a guy who's about to leave seminary or just go take his first church is they'll listen to you for a while if you're a good preacher. And there's a lot of churches hurting for good preaching, or even just solid preaching. You don't have, because nobody's like super good when they start. But if you're faithfully preaching the word and people love the Bible, and especially younger guys, if you go to older churches, they love young preachers, and so they'll put up with quite a bit if you can preach the word faithfully to them. But over time, if you're not known as a loving pastor, if you're not shepherding them, they'll begin to tune you out, even as you get better as a communicator. So if your communication is we would hope ideally normatively improving the more you do it. If you're only the preacher and you're not a pastor, no matter how good you get, they'll wonder if you even believe it. You're daring them to tune you out if you're not, like Peter says in 1 Peter 5, shepherding the flock of God that is among you. So that's kind of the word of advice, is just faithfully preach the word week in and week out, but just love your people and make your love for them evident, however you can.
That's great. Matt, you've recently transitioned to elders after you've been there how many years? 8 years?
I'll start my 10th year next month.
10 years. What kind of advice would you tell someone who's been in the mix maybe 5 to 7 years somewhere, who's still trying to make some change? What kind of advice would you give them?
I mean, it would be don't overestimate what you can do in a few years. Don't underestimate what you can do in 10 to 20. I mean, be patient. I think Jared's right. I think if the people know you love them and you're patient, it'll go a long way. And I would say when it comes to leading change, I really think there is something to being patient and showing that patience with the church. So I mean, one year we instituted a church covenant. Our church had never had a covenant before, and you would think, for some people in our circles, you would think, well, that's just normative Baptist practice. Well, because it was so foreign to this church, it took us over a year to get that covenant in place, because we had meetings and we were explaining it to people and helping kind of shepherd them through their fears about it. And so I think by the time we got to the place where we voted on establishing a covenant, everyone's questions had been answered. And so one of the things I've said all the time is, by the time we get to a vote, I want you to have a clear conscience on what we're voting on, to understand it so well that even if you're voting against it, you could tell me why. And so I've been willing to be patient through all of that, and keep keep a pulse on the church and see where the church is on those issues. Because again, I think longevity in ministry is really important for the local church and for the development of a pastor. And so patience is key there.
That's great. So Jared, two questions. First question is this: Do you have any great ministry stories? Something like your best ministry story that you can pull out, funny or serious, whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, a million of them, but I think the first thing that comes to mind and it is related to something. It's related to what Matt was just talking about in terms of patience, not necessarily in terms of leading change, but patience with people who may be a little rough around the edges or just lack some sanctification in certain areas. And um, I had a dear friend at my last church in Vermont. Her name was Natalie. She was an older lady. And we all know the phenomenon of when fans become critics. I think any pastor who's been in ministry for a while has had a fan who became a critic. And sometimes you have to be somewhat circumspect about someone who has a big fandom about you. If they're talking you up a lot and there could be an idolatry issue there that, like I have learned, not to tell somebody who's really encouraging me or pumping me up that they need to stop or anything. But I just, in my heart, I'm like, I need to not let that go to my head because I've seen this flip so often when somebody puts you on a pedestal. As soon as you disappoint them, that becomes sort of almost a transgression. But we rarely talk about the critic who becomes a fan, and the experience that I've had, in particular with Natalie, to understand her as a critic, she was not a malicious or mean person. She just was very blunt and just kind of, an older lady who just told it like it was. And there's a lot of things I did as a young pastor there or as a new pastor there that she wanted me to be better. And at first I didn't feel it that way. I felt like, who's this lady who's constantly nitpicking me? But the more I spent time with her and the more I saw her heart, number one, the more she got to know me and saw my heart, number one, the less she began to criticize me. But we actually became really good friends. And we served together at the food pantry in the next town over every other week. And, she was, she helped in our benevolence ministry and some other things besides. And she became not just a fan, but a good friend. And she was the last saint that I had the privilege of, preaching her funeral and kind of walking her to the finish line right before I left Vermont for Kansas City. And in some ways, that was a really difficult time. And actually, a few ways, it was a very difficult time. And that was a difficult time as well, helping anyone who's suffering, but also helping someone that is dying and their options are over. She had pancreatic cancer, and so it was a number of months, eventually in hospice and everything. And so every week I'm spending time with her as she's coming to the end. And so that was bitter. The experience of that is bitter, but it was also very sweet because when I started there, I just saw her as the woman who was upset that I wasn't glad handing people at the funeral where I didn't know anybody, and how we ended was she was so afraid I was going to leave for Kansas City before I could preach her funeral. She wanted me to read the same Bible passages to her every time we met. And she's just very dear to me. And so I think stories like that, that was the Lord's doing. But it came about through her being very patient with me, but also because, by God's grace, not just, being defensive with her, but trying to see her heart. There are people who have critical spirits and they're never going to come around on you. But then there's others who, when they become when they turn from critic to fan to friend, that's one of the, most precious ministry moments for me.
Well, you used a phrase in that question that I think would be really good to use when you have someone that's like really critical in spirit, to sit them down and say, brother, you are lacking in sanctification. That might not be.
Yeah.
No.
I've done it. I've done it in the last 2 weeks, obviously, actually.
We won't get into that one. We'll leave that one alone.
Okay.
So let me ask you this as we kind of talk about your ministry as a whole. Once you look back at your writing ministry, how many books have you written now?
I just finished my 28th book.
Nice. Which one has been most talked about? I mean, that's so one of the things I enjoy about writing is when you receive encouragement from people like you've really helped me here or helped me understand this. Which one have you received the most encouragement from or been most talked about? And then the second question is, what are you working on right now? Because you're like always writing a book.
The one that I hear the most about and has had the longest legs and has sold the most is The Imperfect Disciple, which just seemed to click with folks, I think, at a right time. Matt, as you well know, you write these things and you think you're responding to a need, and certainly you're responding to a passion that you have, but you never know if you're going to, get lightning in a bottle, and you put your same heart into every project, and not every project hits. But that one, for whatever reason, just seemed to hit. And so when I hear from folks, and that book came out 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago. I still get invites. I've had, 10 books since then, and I'm still doing Imperfect Disciple conferences and Imperfect Disciple retreats and Imperfect Disciple pastors meetings and all those sorts of things. So that's probably the one. I do hear from pastors quite a bit on the pastor's justification, which is really sweet to me. And that was a book probably 13 or so, maybe a little bit less than that years ago. And I've discovered that it's assigned a lot at schools and things. And so that's been really cool, because at the time I thought this book is so niche, it's not going to really do anything. Yeah. So that's been encouraging.
You just never know.
Yeah. I just finished a book. So the 28th book that I just finished the manuscript for Zondervan. It's called Lest We Drift, Departure Dangers from the One True Gospel. And it's sort of my look at, on the surface, what happened to the gospel-centered movement, like what happened to that, why did that disappear, or why did that recede, I guess, but also underneath some of the different dangers or cultural things that have replaced it within evangelicalism. So I look at the kind of a new legalism. I look at superficiality, resurgent superficiality, kind of what the attractional church has become, different things like that. And it was the hardest book I've ever written. I had to ask for 2 different extensions on it. And part of it was just the style of writing. It's a lot more footnotes and things than I've ever done. It's cultural commentary, which isn't what I normally do. And it also kind of walking a fine line. And this is the first time I've ever had a publisher say this to me, but they wanted me to name more names. And it's just isn't my deal. I'm not a, let me go after people kind of guy. And, when I do, I'm not saying I always do it right, but when I do, I really think strongly that something needs to be said, because I don't want to I'm not trying to throw, grenades every day. But in the book, I would speak vaguely about certain controversies or certain things, and the publisher, which they don't normally like that. They normally don't want you naming names because it could put them in hot water. They were asking, can you be more specific? Give us an example. Who's somebody who does this? And so
I feel like it's only right if right here we just start naming names now.
Well,
just kidding.
It has the potential. Well, the Christian nationalism thing comes up in there, but it has the potential for being a provocative, I guess is the word, kind of book. But towards the end, what I'm trying to do is just stump for not a gospel-centered movement. Like I don't care about whether we have a big conference or the institution or whatever anymore, or whether the publishers want to put out gospel, in the title kind of books or anything. My concern is just in the meat, in the marrow of church life and in Christian life. What are we so preoccupied with that's better than the glory of Jesus Christ? And so the last chapter, I kind of say, like, forget trying to get back to podcasts and conferences and publishing juggernauts. Just in your church, and if you're a leader in your ministry, what does it actually look like to be gospel centered? And shouldn't we do that as opposed to this other stuff that we've decided is so much more crucial? So that's what I just finished up. I have another book on pastoral mentoring that I just finished as well for Lexham in their ministry guides series. Harold Sinkbeel's the editor there. And then we're shopping a proposal, Matt, you know all about this, on 80s movies, which is completely out of left field from anything I've ever written.
Oh, man, me, Lord.
It's a
I'm
passion
so
project.
intrigued by this.
I have a publisher who's very interested, And so I just finished a couple sample chapters because they kind of wanted to see. It's kind of a Chuck Klosterman short essays on 32 different 80s films and kind of the different virtues or lack thereof that we find in those movies.
So this is the
amazing.
book form. Oh, this is the book form of the seeker-sensitive movement somewhere in the movies. Is that what
Yeah.
Yeah. The
I'm
gospel
already
according to.
anticipating people like, I'm anticipating taking hits for this book and just saying, look, 29 books, spot me one to talk about movies. Like
Willow Wilson is back.
Right.
the downgrade is real, I guess.
That's hilarious. Hey, Matt, aren't you also, didn't you just finish a book?
I did on beauty, aesthetics, art, and theology, the Christian life. Jared read it.
Love
read
it.
it.
It's very good.
Thank you.
If anyone could write on beauty, it would be Matt. I mean,
The most
look at
beautiful
that head.
man in North
Right.
Carolina.
Beard, comb, and everything.
I'm working on a book right now with another pastor called Every Member Matters, which is on membership, but it's more of an action oriented. It's lots of good books on membership with 9 Marks and some other guys explaining kind of what a member is biblically. This book is really aimed at what does a member do. So it's a book that a pastor might want to hand a new member and say, every member is a disciple maker, every member is a giver, every member is a so it's kind of that feel. And I'm also writing the Deuteronomy study for Explore the Bible, which is the Sunday school curriculum for all the older Southern Baptist churches. So
Nice.
blessing the saints.
Nice. Well, I want to say thanks to both of you guys for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. Really appreciate you, Jared. Hey, give our listeners a quick, shot at where they can find you. I hope that many of them already follow you, but if they can't, if they aren't, where would they find you at?
Yeah, just go to jaredcwilson.com and there's a page with my books there. There's a page with links to my social media there. That's kind of the one-stop shop, jaredcwilson.com.
Well, thanks, guys. And thanks to all of our listeners for listening today. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. When you do that, it really helps grow our podcast. And as we grow, we're able to have more conversations just like this one with some of the best leaders in church ministry across the country. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.